One of the very first questions that we ask whenever we're trying to give people advice on starting a ball python breeding business is, what segment of the market do they think they can serve best? And I think that this question is something that a lot of people don't really consider because they assume that the entire reptile market is the same. But I think that there are huge differences between the breeding side of the market, the pet keeping side of the market, and the general public, and each of these three major segments are ones that somebody could make an amazing reptile business focusing on. But if you are not careful, it is very, very likely that you could be alienating one, two, or maybe even all of these different segments when you are trying to make your ball python breeding business. My name's Steven with Leviathan Snakes, and let's jump in. Starting off with the breeder segment, because that's our primary target audience. Now, there is so many different types of breeders. You can be looking at brand new entry-level breeders who are trying to learn the process of breeding versus the people who've been in for 20 or 30 years and are at the top of the ball python game. The types of content, the types of marketing that is effective for each of these different types of people, even though they are both ball python breeders, is completely different even within one of these bigger segments. So, in general, what we want to talk about is if you are trying to focus on ball python breeders as your target audience, you have to understand that their driving motivating factor in purchasing a new animal is to create something even better down the line. So the animals that they are purchasing, while they do want very, very pretty, amazing animals, that's not actually the main reason why they're picking something up. Instead, they want to get the babies from that animal. And if the babies are going to be absolutely amazing, or at least have a chance to be absolutely amazing, there is a chance that that animal might still be a good purchase for them, even if it just looks like a normal. So, with this, we have to understand that breeders are not necessarily concerned about the individual animal, though oftentimes they love their animals and they form emotional connections and bonds to them, which can make it a little bit difficult if they're trying to run it like a business and later on they find out or they realize that that animal doesn't really fit into their business plans. But beyond all of that, realistically, what the primary thing breeders are looking for and what primary thing that breeders want to know deals with the offspring of whatever they're going to be purchasing. On the entry-level breeder side, they are often looking for content that is teaching them how to breed the animals. What temperatures do they need? What is the process of breeding? When should they pair? How often should they pair? How do they incubate eggs? Things like this. And these more how-to tutorial type videos is teaching them the skills that they need in order to be successful simply on reproducing the animals that they love. So I think that this whole segment right here, the entry-level breeders within the breeder category, these are going to be your basic breeding videos. These are going to be your basic breeding content. Beyond the basic breeding content, oftentimes entry-level breeders need a lot of information so that way they can try to understand how the morphs work specifically together in different combos. And these are going to be like morph ID videos or clutch cuttings so that way they can see how the different genes interact with each other. These are going to be amazing pieces of content for the entry-level breeder segment because it's the information that they really need to understand before they can really produce animals, and even if they do produce animals, so they can ID them correctly and subsequently sell them. The next niche that we want to talk about within the breeder segment is the kind of aspiring business breeders or the enthusiast level breeders. These are the people who already understand all of the steps about breeding the animals and now they're looking for more business type things. These are going to be, how do they sell the animals effectively? How do they market themselves as a brand and as a business? What do they need to do shows? What are tips on shows? How do they do well online? All of these different things are going to be questions, pain points that the kind of enthusiast reptile businesses are going to have, and it's the content that they're going to be seeking out. So this type of content will do really, really well with them, but in general, nobody else, when it comes to the reptile hobby, if you're looking at pet keepers or the general public, really cares how somebody should market their reptile business. It's not content that appeals to them. So while it might be amazing for this specific segment, it tends to not really perform well outside of it. Transitioning over to the pet keeper side, so when we're talking about the pet keeper segment, we're not necessarily talking about the person who has just got their very first reptile. Instead, we're talking about the people who are entrenched, that they love the reptile hobby, but they have absolutely no intention of breeding, and they really just want to keep the animals as their pets. And this specific segment tends to do really big deep dives in enclosures. They do deep dives into different species. They do a lot of stuff that are about reptiles overall and not necessarily about reproducing one specific species or understanding the intricacies of the specific morphs with a species. So, with this in mind, oftentimes the pet keeper segment is going to want to know leading edge, innovative studies dealing with the health and well-being and husbandry of the animals that they keep. They often want to know what kinds of enrichment is actually effective and what doesn't really do anything. Do they need to introduce UVB for specific species, or does a species perform better without it? And these different types of things are what the pet keeping segment tends to really focus on. In addition to just general husbandry stuff for the pet keeping segment, I believe that the pet keeping segment really likes to compare and contrast different types of species against each other. So this could be things like, what are the top 5 best pet reptiles, where they're talking about not necessarily a specific morph, but about a bunch of different species and the pros and cons of each. I think that this stuff really appeals to the pet keeping segment, more of the entry level on the pet keeping segment. The third big segment is the general public, and the content that appeals to the general public tends to really not appeal to the breeding segment and the hardcore pet keeping segment. And the reason why is that this content is often sensational. It is leveraging fear and anxiety, maybe a little bit of morbid curiosity in order to capture the public's attention who has no experience with reptiles and potentially bring them in. So stuff like this is snake biting videos, or live feeding videos, or even potentially people being scared and surprised by a random reptile appearing in a location or in a situation that they weren't expecting. And I think that all of these different pieces of content can go viral in the public realm, but they tend to be really hard to bring a positive light to the reptile hobby. And oftentimes they don't really promote the idea of reptile keeping. Now, there is one exception to this that I felt that Gen Z did really well, even though they're no longer part of the breeding hobby, and that was that they leveraged some snake biting type videos, but what they specifically did is they showed how inconsequential a ball python bite was, and that essentially it was nothing to be afraid of. And these videos did really well, and I felt that this was a positive spin to the traditional viral snake biting video that is often done where people are faking how scared they are in order to make it more sensational and bring in more views. So there is ways to go about hitting the content that appeals to the public in a positive light for the reptile hobby, but I think that you have to be very careful because it is so easy to make the hobby look bad, make it look like that we're keeping a bunch of animals that exist solely off of killing other animals, and overall it's not a good way to grow the hobby in my opinion. So now that we have the overview out of the way, let's dive a little bit deeper on content that might excel in one segment, but potentially turn off the other segment. So on the breeding side, I generally think that anything dealing with business can be really, really valuable to the breeding segment, and it tends to do well when you are moving up in those kind of higher tiers in the ball python breeding world. But that specific content doesn't do well in the pet segment, and it's not really interesting. It's kind of boring to the general public. So for the general public, they just ignore it because it doesn't matter to them. They don't care about the tax implications of buying reptiles and buying equipment for a reptile business. And for the pet segment, they might look at this as somebody who makes too much business content, that they only care about the money and they don't care about the animals. So if you are primarily trying to create animals that are going to be either somebody's very first pet reptile, or they're in that price point where realistically other breeders are not going to be buying them, and the people who are going to be buying them are pet keepers, I think that it's not going to really do you any favors on making business type content for your YouTube channel or on any social media account. But if you are specifically either right now producing animals that are good for breeders or want to produce animals that will be perfect for breeders, then I think it does make sense to focus on the business side of things in your marketing and in your social media content. Moving on to content that can excel in the pet segment, but it might not mean anything to the general public, and it might turn off the breeding segment, is people who end up demonizing either the industry of breeding or the practices of breeding. And oftentimes this deals with husbandry, it also deals with the business type of thing, and essentially, if somebody is trying to make animals that are going to be focused on other breeders, and they end up talking about how breeders who keep their animals in racks are abusing their animals, because that is a fairly common stance that some people in the pet segment have towards breeders, that likely is going to turn off almost everybody in the breeding segment, because breeders have different needs and they prioritize different things when it comes to keeping large amounts of animals versus the pet segment does. So I don't want to do a whole video getting into the pros and cons of racks versus enclosures, but generally speaking, racks are easier to clean, they're easier to maintain temperatures, and they're easier to maintain humidity than larger, more display style enclosures are. And because of these reasons, breeders often not only think that the way that they care for their animals is adequate, they often think that the way that they care for their animals is the way that they should be cared for and is the best way to do it. And that doesn't mean that it's true, but if somebody is telling a breeder who might potentially buy a snake from them in the future that the way they're doing everything is wrong, it's very likely that that breeder isn't going to appreciate it, and they very likely are not going to come and buy a snake from that person in the future. So, in my opinion, if you are trying to make content that appeals to the pet segment, the enclosure husbandry type videos is perfect for it, but it is very possible that it will turn off the breeding segment depending on exactly how the content is being positioned. One last thing on the enclosure type of content is that for the general public, this isn't sensational enough and it's not engaging enough for them to click on a video and watch how you should set up a ball python enclosure unless they already had interest in the animals to begin with. So I think that for the most part, the public doesn't really care about this content at all, but it's not negative or positive, it just doesn't catch their interest. Last, as we talked about already, the general public tends to like more sensational things, and it's less about the animals themselves and it's more about people's reactions to the animals. So this is people's reaction to a snake bite or a live feeding video or things like this, and it is the emotional connection that they are making with the people, not with the animals, that is catching their interest and drawing them into the hobby. But while we've already talked about one way that you might be able to take content that does really well for the public and repurpose it into a positive light in the reptile hobby, I think that there's one style of content that we don't see very often because one, it's way harder to make than simply a topic-based video, and that is individual people's stories on how they were able to achieve a goal or how they overcame some type of adversity within the reptile hobby. And you see this most often in documentary filmmaking, where it follows somebody who is trying to climb a mountain, and you might not have any interest at all in mountain climbing, but you are engaged with the individual people and you want to see how were they able to achieve or fail at whatever they were trying to set out to do. And I think that content like this, if it was done well, this could be a way to bring people from the general public into the reptile hobby in a way that isn't sensational, and it is really making them connected to individual people and growing the hobby in, realistically, ways that we haven't really seen before. To sum everything up, I think that there is amazing ways that anybody could target each of these different segments, and it's very likely, if they are effective at it, that they will see growth no matter what the rest of the hobby looks like. But depending on exactly the type of content you're making and how you're positioning it, you might be sacrificing different segments of the market in order to focus on the one that you want right now. And if that one that you want right now isn't viable from a business perspective long term, you might get a ton of views right now, but it might not result in the sales that you want in order to be a successful ball python breeder. Anyways, there's so many different things to consider when it comes to building a business, when it comes to starting any type of marketing effort, but by understanding who your target audience is and what they want, you can very quickly, very easily make content that is going to appeal to them, draw attention to your brand, and hopefully promote your goals in the future. Anyways, we hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe, and we will see you next week.